watched the sea turn to ink before my very eyes, the swell flattening as though some vast hull lay just beneath, arresting the waves. The men fell silent without command. The air cooled with a suddenness that stung my teeth. No gull cried, no rope creaked. The water bulged, soundless, shaping itself around an absence that should not have held form at all. Men have asked me to recount this, though I am an old man now, and my hand shakes upon the paper. If you would hear more of such voyages, lend your attention, offer your approval, and set down your own thoughts and questions, as sailors once left notes in bottles for those who followed. To understand what we encountered off Tristan da Cunha, I must return to the winter of 1922, when the sea still felt to me like a ledger that could be balanced. Every phenomenon entered and explained. We sailed from Cape Town aboard the factory ship Albatross on 6 July 1922, bound for the whaling grounds west of Tristan. I was then 30 years of age, a junior officer and navigator, trained in hydrography and possessed of a confidence that now seems to me almost indecent. Our work was plain enough: to meet 2 catcher boats off Tristan da Cunha, take their oil and carcasses aboard, and chart certain depths for the company's future use. The island lay near the center of the South Atlantic, some 1,500 miles from the Cape, a volcanic cone rising alone from a waste of water. I had read of it in the accounts of earlier mariners who spoke of its clouds and sheer cliffs, of the small settlement on the north side where British subjects clung to the rock like barnacles. None of them had spoken of anything unnatural. Our captain, James Hargreaves, had been at sea since boyhood, a spare, weathered man who trusted his sextant more than any chart printed before 1900. With him were Henderson, chief engineer, a broad Scot with a ruined laugh, and young Ellis, a harpooner on one of the catchers, who came aboard Albatross when seas grew rough and his small vessel lay alongside. I name these men because they are the only ones whose faces still rise clear before me at night. The first days were uneventful. We made good time under a low grey sky, the engines beating a steady measure. I took noon sights, corrected our course by dead reckoning and the faint smear of the Milky Way when the clouds parted. The wireless crackled now and then with distant traffic, mostly commercial codes and weather reports from ships we would never see. The ocean had its usual voices: the slap of waves against steel, the faint complaint of timbers, the thud and hiss of the engines through the deck. The first oddity was so slight that at the time it scarcely merited an entry in my notebook. On the 4th day out, as we approached the latitude of Tristan, I noticed that the sea, which should have been running in a long swell from the west, lay strangely confused. Short, choppy waves met us from several directions at once, though the wind held steady from the north. The captain remarked upon it at the rail. "Cross seas," he said. "There must be weather upon the island. The place makes its own storms." I agreed. It was a simple enough observation, yet I remember now the way his hand lingered on the rail, his knuckles whitening as though he felt something through the steel. That night, I lay awake in my narrow berth, listening. The usual creaks and groans of the ship came to me, but under them, very faint, I thought I heard a slow, distant thudding as of a heavy object striking water at long intervals. I counted between the sounds. They did not match the beat of the engines, nor the swing of the ship, nor any familiar rhythm. I told myself it was some peculiarity of the hull, some resonance of the machinery. I slept at last, if uneasily. On 11 July we sighted Tristan da Cunha, a dark wedge rising from a ring of surf, its summit lost in cloud. Snow lay in streaks along the upper slopes. We hove to some miles off the north coast, where the settlement lay, and waited for the islanders' boat to come out. The sea there was calmer, though the wind still blew in fitful gusts, and the air had that peculiar chill that comes from high land close by. While we waited, I stood with Ellis by the rail. He was not long from Devon, with the pale, freckled skin of one who had not yet learned to fear the sun. He smoked a foul pipe and spoke of his young wife, whom he had left behind in Plymouth. "She will not have me at this again," he said, smiling without much mirth. "I promised her this would be the last season. I thought if I came back with a share worth the name, we might have a little shop. A tobacconist, perhaps. Something that does not roll under one's feet." "You will have your shop," I said, more certain then than I can now account for. "These are good grounds by all reports. The company would not send us here else." He nodded, watching the island. Strange to think of men living here their whole lives, nothing but rock and sea. "Do you suppose they grow used to it, or does it gnaw at them?" I considered. "Men can grow used to anything, I think, provided they have one another." He laughed then, a short sound whipped away by the wind. I remember the way his eyes watered from the cold, and how he drew his coat tighter, as though some draught had found him. The islanders came out in a stout boat, bringing potatoes, onions, and a few chickens to trade for flour and cloth. They were a mixed lot, descendants of British, Dutch, and other castaways, with weathered faces and a wary courtesy. One of them, a man named Glass, spoke fair English and came aboard to confer with the captain. They spoke of the weather, the scarcity of ships, the price of oil. I listened only with half an ear until I heard Glass say, in a lower tone, "You will not take your small boats close under the southwest, Captain. The ground there is bad. There are movements." "Movements?" Hargreaves frowned. "You mean the ground rises? Shoaling?" Glass hesitated. "Not like that. The water itself is restless. It is old talk among us. The men do not fish there." The captain snorted softly. "I have seen restless water before, Mr. Glass. We shall mind our soundings." The islander looked at him with a peculiar expression, as though he meant to say more and thought better of it. "Mind them well," he said only. "The sea is not the same in all places, even when it looks so." I might have forgotten that exchange had it not been for what followed. We parted from the islanders by late afternoon and steamed west-southwest to meet our catcher boats at an agreed position some 20 miles off the island's southwestern quadrant. The sky lowered, and a thin rain began to fall, misting the decks. We sighted the first catcher, the Ajax. By dusk, her low hull rising and falling on the swell like a seal. The second, the Petrel, was reported by wireless to be working further to the west. That night, the strange thudding returned, more distinct. I lay awake and counted. There were 9 beats, then a pause of perhaps a minute, then 9 more. I rose and dressed, telling myself I would go below and speak to Henderson about some imagined issue with the engines. Instead, I found myself drawn to the deck. The wind had fallen. The sea shone black and oily under a sky without stars. The ship's lamps cast a feeble yellow about the superstructure, but beyond that circle all was a uniform dark. I went to the rail and listened. The sound came again, a deep, muffled concussion, as though some vast, soft mass struck the water far below. It seemed to come from our starboard quarter towards the southwest, where the sea lay unbroken. I strained my eyes but saw nothing. Beside me, to my surprise, stood Captain Hargreaves, wrapped in his greatcoat. "You hear it," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." I thought perhaps some hammering in the engine room. He shook his head. "Henderson has his men idle at this hour," I asked him. "He hears it also, through the plates, but there is nothing amiss in his realm." We stood listening together. The beats came again, regular and yet somehow uneven, as though whatever made them was not a machine but a living thing, exerting itself. Whales, perhaps? I ventured. Sound carries oddly at night. Hargreaves did not immediately answer. When he did, his voice was low. I have heard whales all my life, Mr. Carrow. They sing, they blow, they strike with their flukes. They do not do this. The next day, 12 July, dawned with a sallow light. We rendezvoused with Petrel and took aboard her first casks of oil. The men went about their work with the usual banter, but there was a slight quickness to their movements, a desire to be done and underway. Several of the hands spoke of a strange calm in the night, of a feeling that their own voices were too loud. By noon the wind veered, and we found ourselves in the lee of Tristan, the island a dark mass to the northeast. To the southwest the sea lay in a broad, unnatural smoothness, as though some vast oil slick had stilled the waves. Yet there was no smell of oil, no rainbow sheen, only a dull, heavy surface that seemed to absorb the light. The captain ordered soundings. We slowed and paid out the lead, marked in fathoms by strips of leather and cloth. At 30 fathoms, the line went suddenly slack, as though it had fallen free into a void. Henderson, who stood by, frowned. Odd, he said. We should have more depth here, not less. The chart gives 200 fathoms at least. We tried again. This time, at 28 fathoms, the lead struck something soft, then bounced, then dropped once more. When we hauled it up, the tallow on its base, which should have brought up sand or mud, bore only a faint smear of greyish, gelatinous matter that smelled of iron and something faintly sweet. One of the hands, a Dane named Sorensen, crossed himself without seeming aware of it. Some manner of jellyfish, I said. There are great medusae in these waters, then it is the largest I have yet met, Henderson replied, and lying very still. We took samples, wrapped them in oilskin, and stowed them in a cool locker for later examination. I wrote the incident in the log with as much detachment as I could muster, though the pen felt heavy in my fingers. That afternoon, as we worked the boats, the gulls that had followed us for days wheeled away, one by one, until the sky above was empty. At the time, I noted only that their absence meant a cleaner deck. In retrospect, it was the second warning I failed to heed. The microshock that truly unsettled us came the following morning, when the sea itself seemed to answer our intrusion. We had lowered one of the ship's own whaleboats, manned by Ellis and 4 others, to run a line to Ajax, which lay half a mile off. The water between us and the catcher was of that same unnatural smoothness, a dark plate with only the faintest undulation. I watched through my glass as the boat pulled away, oars dipping in unison. Halfway to Ajax, the boat checked. The men shipped oars and looked about them. I raised the glass and saw, with perfect clarity, the surface around the boat lift and subside in a slow, circular swell, as though some enormous, unseen object turned beneath them. The boat rocked, but there was no wave, no crest, no sound. Then, with a violence that made every man aboard Albatross start, the line we had paid out to the boat snapped taut and jerked from the bollard, as though seized by a sudden, impossible weight. The free end whipped across the deck, scoring the planks and narrowly missing a seaman's leg. Out on the water, Ellis' boat slewed sideways, nearly capsizing, though no wave struck it. Haul in, for God's sake," the captain shouted, his voice cracking. The men scrambled to the winch, to the spare line. By the time we had secured a new rope and cast it, the swell had subsided. Ellis and his crew, pale and grim, bent to their oars and came back under their own power. When they clambered aboard, Ellis' hands shook so that he could not at first light his pipe. "What happened?" I asked him later. When he had regained some color, he stared at me for a moment, as though choosing which words would not make him ridiculous. "There was something under us," he said at last. "I felt it. Not like a fish, like when a train passes under a bridge and you feel it in your boots. Only it was the water that moved, and then the rope it was, as if it had been taken hold of." "By what?" I asked, though I knew he had no answer. He looked past me, to the southwest, where the sea lay dark and still. "By something that knew it was there," he said quietly. From that point, the men's unease grew. They spoke less, laughed seldom. At night, the strange thudding continued, at times so strong that cups rattled in their racks. The air would grow suddenly cold on deck, breath pluming white, though the thermometer showed no corresponding change. Once, in the small hours, I went up to take a star sight and found Henderson standing alone by the rail, his face turned to the sea. "Do you smell it?" he asked without preamble. I inhaled. There was the usual tang of salt and oil, the faint reek of the carcasses in our holds. Beneath that, barely perceptible, I caught a whiff of something metallic and sweet, like blood left too long in a basin. "It is only the works," I said. "We have had a heavy take." He shook his head. "The works smell of death. This is different." On 15 July, the weather closed in. A low, unbroken cloud settled over us. The wind died almost entirely. The sea became a grey plain without horizon, sky and water merging in a dull sameness. The wireless grew erratic, full of static and faint, half-heard voices that the operator could not pin to any call sign. Ajax reported by lamp that her compass was wandering several degrees without cause. That night, I woke to a silence so complete that for a moment I thought myself deaf. No engine throb, no creak of timber, no slap of wave, only the faint rasp of my own breath. I rose, heart hammering, and went to the porthole. The glass showed only blackness. I dressed and went up. On deck, several men already stood, drawn by the same absence. The ship lay motionless, as though embedded in tar. The water around us was so still that it reflected the few lamps we had left, burning with disquieting clarity, as though we floated in air. "Engines stopped?" I asked Henderson, who had just emerged. "No," he said, his voice hushed in spite of himself. "They turn, but we do not move. The screws might as well be chewing at stone." The captain ordered the engines reversed, then ahead full, then stopped entirely. There was no discernible effect. Our wake, such as it was, spread only a few yards before fading, as though swallowed from beneath. Then came a sound I have not found words adequate to describe, though I have tried in vain for many years. It was not the thudding we had heard before, though that underlay it. It was a low, rising moan, felt as much in the bones as heard, that seemed to come from the water itself, from all around us and below. The men clapped hands to their ears. One fell to his knees, retching. The moan rose, held, then ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing void. In that instant of silence, every man aboard knew, without words, that we were no longer merely observers on that sea, but objects of some other attention. The peak encounter came then, though at the time it did not feel like a peak, only like a continuation of a descent that had begun days earlier. The water to our starboard began to lift, not in a wave, but as a broad, domed swelling, perhaps 50 yards across. The surface did not break. It rose smooth and dark, reflecting our lamps in a distorted smear. At its highest, the swell stood a good 10 feet above the surrounding level, yet its edges were sharp, as though something solid pressed up beneath the skin. Every instinct in me demanded that I look away. Instead, I found myself stepping to the rail, knuckles white, eyes fixed. Within that bulging darkness, patterns began to move. At first I thought them reflections of our own rigging, but they did not match. Lines of paler grey slid and coiled, intersecting, forming for a moment shapes that suggested ribs or arches, or the faint, wrong geometry of a thing that had never seen the sun. There was no eye, no fin, no recognizable limb, only an intimation of immensity, of mass, arranged in a manner that did not accord with any natural design I knew. The smell grew stronger, that sweet, metallic taint, now mixed with a faint musk that made the throat itch. The air grew so cold that frost formed along the rail beneath my hands. My breath came in plumes. Beside me, Ellis whispered, "It is looking at us." I might have laughed at that, had not every hair on my arms and neck stood up at once, as though in answer. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the bulge subsided. The lines within it uncoiled and slid down, vanishing into the black. The sea leveled. The engines, which had labored uselessly, took hold again with a shudder that ran through the hull. The ship lurched forward a yard or two. No one spoke. The men stood as if turned to salt. Only when the captain barked, "Back to your stations," in a voice that shook, did life return to the deck. In the immediate aftermath, a strange quiet settled over us. Not the oppressive silence of before, but a human one, born of fear and the unwillingness to name it. The captain called his officers to the chart room. His face, usually so controlled, was drawn. "We are leaving these grounds," he said, without preamble. "At first light, we turn east, back to Tristan, and from there to the Cape. We have oil enough for the season." Henderson frowned. "The company will not thank us for it, sir." "The company is not here," Hargreaves replied. "We are, and I will not have my ship held fast by whatever devilry that was." He looked at me. "Mr. Carrow, you will make a note in the log. Unusual currents and magnetic disturbance in the vicinity of Tristan southwest. Navigation impaired. Nothing more." I hesitated. "Sir, should we not record, we shall record what can be believed," he said sharply. "Do you wish to be thought a fool, or worse, a drunkard? Do you wish these men to be questioned by clerks in London who have never seen the sea?" I said nothing. He was right, of course, in the narrow sense. Yet, as I wrote the bland words later, my hand trembled with the knowledge of what I omitted. We turned east at dawn. The engines seemed eager, the screws biting cleanly. The sea, while still unnaturally smooth in patches, no longer held us. Tristan's dark bulk grew on the horizon like a promise of solidity. The men moved with a new urgency, coiling ropes, securing gear, as though by tidiness they could ward off what lay behind. Conversation was low and practical. No one mentioned the bulging water, the lines within it. When two men began to speak of the night in hushed tones, a third snapped, "Enough," with such vehemence that they fell silent. As we neared the island, a pod of dolphins appeared off our bow, leaping and playing in the spray. The sight, which at another time would have cheered us, only deepened my unease. They kept to the side away from the southwest, as though some invisible boundary marked the limit of their comfort. We anchored off the settlement once more. The islanders came out, their boat pitching in the slight swell. Glass climbed aboard and took one look at our faces. "You have been too far to the southwest," he said quietly. The captain did not deny it. "We encountered difficulties," he said. "Strange calms, unusual soundings." Glass nodded slowly. "The old men say the sea remembers things there. Old shapes, old weights. We do not go." "Have you seen," I began, then stopped, for what could I say? "Have you seen the water itself, rise around a thing that is not there? Glass regarded me with a pity that stung. "We have seen enough," he said. "Some things a man does not put into words if he wishes to sleep." We took on fresh water and a few provisions, then weighed anchor and set course for Cape Town. The return journey should have been a relief. In many ways it was. The sea resumed its familiar moods, the wind returned, the gulls followed us once more, yet a tension remained, like a taut line that had not been properly eased. At night, I dreamed of that bulging water, of the pale lines sliding within it. I would wake with my heart racing, the taste of iron in my mouth. Once, in the small hours, I went to the deck for air and found Ellis there, staring back the way we had come. "I thought I heard it," he said when he noticed me. "That sound, the beating." "Your mind plays tricks," I said, though I too had been listening for it. He shook his head. "No, it is quieter, but it is not gone. It is as if something very large has turned over in its sleep, and we have stepped too near the bed." We reached Cape Town on 28 July. The harbour, with its bustle of tugs and lighters, its cries and smells and solid quays, felt almost indecently alive. The company's agent came aboard, full of questions about our yield, our fuel consumption, the state of the machinery. He glanced only briefly at our faces. In the days that followed, the captain and I prepared our official report. It spoke of moderate success in the whaling grounds, of weather typical for the season, of minor navigational anomalies near Tristan da Cunha's southwest quadrant. We attached the sample of gelatinous matter from the lead, now dried to a brittle, colorless film, with a note requesting chemical analysis. When I suggested mentioning the immobilization of the ship, the captain tapped the paper with one finger. "We say, temporary loss of headway due to suspected countercurrent," he said. "That is all." "And the phenomenon itself?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "What would you have us write, Mr. Caro? That the sea rose in a manner inconsistent with known hydrodynamics? That we felt the attention of an unseen mass? That the water smelled wrong? We have no measurements, no photographs, no instruments that recorded anything out of the ordinary? Only our eyes, which men ashore are too ready to say deceive us. Then we lie," I said, more sharply than was prudent. "We omit," he corrected. "There is a difference. We record what can be acted upon. Ships may give that quadrant a wider berth. That is something." The company's reply, when it came months later, was terse. Our yield was below expectation. The mention of magnetic irregularities and unreliable soundings was noted and filed. The gelatinous sample was deemed organic residue of no particular interest. There was no further comment. In the years that followed, I tried, at first, to treat the matter as a puzzle. I read what I could of oceanography, of submarine topography, of the curious effects of temperature and salinity on water density. I considered the possibility of vast schools of jellyfish, of submarine volcanic activity, of gas emissions from the seabed that might alter buoyancy. None of these explanations satisfied me. None accounted for the pattern in the bulging water, the lines that had moved with such dreadful deliberation, nor for the sense so strong at the time, so easy to doubt in recollection, that we had been observed. I met Henderson once more, in 1927, in a public house near the docks in Liverpool. He had left the sea, taken a position with a shipyard. His hair had gone almost entirely white. We spoke first of ordinary things, wages, old ships, mutual acquaintances. Only after 2 pints did he say, without preamble, "I hear the thudding sometimes, at night, in the pipes, in the walls. My wife says it is my heart." "Perhaps it is," I said, though I knew what he meant. He looked at me steadily. "You see it still, do you not? In your mind. That swell." "Yes," I admitted. He nodded, as though I had confirmed a private hypothesis. I thought, for a time, that if I could find the right words for it, it would lessen. But there are no right words. "Have you spoken of it to anyone else?" I asked. He shook his head. "To what end? Men believe in storms and reefs. They do not believe that the sea itself may." He broke off, searching for a word and failing. "I tell them only that there are places best left alone." We parted with an awkward handshake. I never saw him again. I read, some years later, that he had died of an apoplexy in his sleep. I wondered, unreasonably, if he had heard the thudding at the last. As for Ellis, he returned to Devon at the end of that season. I received a letter from him in 1924, written in a cramped hand. He had indeed opened a small tobacconist's shop, as he had hoped. He wrote of his wife, of their infant daughter, of the quiet satisfaction of weighing out tobacco instead of oil. At the end, in a postscript, he added, "Sometimes, when the shop is very still, I feel as if the floor has dropped a fathom, then risen again. The pipes rattle on their hooks. The customers never seem to notice. I do not speak of it to my wife." I wrote back, but my letter was returned months later, marked "Addressee deceased." "An influenza," they said. There was no mention of anything else. The years passed. I left the sea in 1930 and took a post with the Hydrographic Office, where I spent my days drawing charts of coasts I would never see again. On the wall near my desk hung an Admiralty chart of the South Atlantic, Tristan da Cunha, a small, neat symbol in a waste of white. Often my eye would stray to the unmarked water southwest of the island, where no soundings were yet recorded. Once, in 1935, I proposed a surveying expedition to improve the charting of that area. The Admiralty, always cautious with funds, declined. "There is little traffic there," they wrote. "Existing data are sufficient for present needs." I felt an obscure relief. From time to time, in shipping news or obscure journals, I would read of vessels reporting unusual calms or peculiar fogs near Tristan. None spoke of immobilization, of bulging water. Perhaps they had not experienced it. Perhaps, like us, they had chosen their words carefully. In my own life, the encounter made itself felt in small, insidious ways. I found that I could no longer bear to stand on a pier and look straight down at the water. The sight of that flat, dark surface, with its hint of depth, would set my heart racing. I avoided baths, preferring a quick wash at the basin. I could not sleep in a room where the ticking of a clock echoed too strongly. The regular beat would, in the small hours, turn itself into that slow, distant thudding. There were triggers I did not at first recognize. Once, in a winter fog on the Thames, the sound of a ship's horn, low and mournful, sent me back in an instant to that night off Tristan, the air in my lungs turning to ice. Another time, in a museum, I stood before the skeleton of a great whale, its ribs arching overhead, and felt a sudden, irrational conviction that the bones were wrong, incomplete, that some essential element of its structure, the very thing that made it harmless, was missing. I told the full story only twice. The first time was to a young naval officer in 1942. When the war had made men more willing to contemplate horrors, he listened politely, then said, "There are submarines, sir, that can do strange things with a ship's wake." I did not argue. How could I explain that what we had felt was not the cold, mechanical malice of a machine, but something older and less comprehensible? The second time is now, in these pages, with my hand unsteady and my breath shorter than it was. I have long since ceased to seek an explanation. that will satisfy the part of me that once believed the world could be neatly accounted for. I have read of deep-sea trenches, of abyssal plains, of creatures that live in darkness under pressures we can scarcely imagine. None of that knowledge has brought me closer to understanding what held our ship that night, what rose beneath us in a shape defined more by absence than by form. If there is any conclusion I have reached, it is only this: that the sea is not a uniform element, but a vast, layered thing, with regions as distinct in character as any continent. We sail upon its skin and think we know it, because we have measured some depths and named some currents. But there are hollows and folds and old scars in that mass of water where other principles may hold sway, where time moves differently, where shapes that are not for us abide. Men will continue to go to sea. They will hunt whales, lay cables, wage wars, and carry goods. They will cross near Tristan da Cunha and see only a solitary island under its cap of cloud. Most will pass untroubled. A few, perhaps, will feel their engines labor for no reason, will hear a faint, distant beating that does not match any machine, will see the water smooth itself into a dark, waiting plain. When I close my eyes at night, I no longer see the island, nor the faces of the men. I see instead that bulge in the water, rising slow and soundless, the pale lines within it shifting in patterns that my mind still tries and fails to resolve. I feel again the sudden cold on my teeth, the weight of a gaze without eyes, and in the quietest moments, when the house is still and there is some distant, regular noise, a cart passing over cobbles, a neighbor's boot upon the stair, I find myself counting between the sounds, listening for a rhythm that should not be there, and wondering what vast, patient shape might even now be turning, unseen, in the dark.